that we should all be asking ourselves. I don't actually think lawyers are going to be like the frontline leaders of any of this stuff. I think we have a lot of skills to contribute, and we get to see what happens in the system, and we should be raising awareness and bringing attention to how the criminal system is a tool by people who have power to really control and extract wealth from people who don't have power. But I think it's really the organizing as ordinary people where we lawyers can make the most difference, getting together with our own communities, our churches, our schools, our professional associations, our businesses, our law firms, where we stand up to this stuff. And I think if we don't come together and we don't actually devote a portion of our lives and our careers to organizing in that way, we're not going to have power, because politics is all about organized political power, and local politicians and state politicians and national politicians, they respond to who they think has power. And power only comes from banding together with other people. So one of the things that we try to work on at our organization is when we don't just do legal cases to win in the court. We try to think about how a particular court case might help a community build a narrative and build connections and build relationships, so that what happens, whether win or lose, there's a fundamental change in the power structure. I'll give you an example with bail. You know, there was a very much a lawyer-driven, top-down bail reform movement in the 1960s, led by Bobby Kennedy and a bunch of judges, a bunch of wealthy white lawyers. And they ended up getting rid of the cash bail system, basically, in the federal courts. On the day they got rid of the cash bail system in federal courts, 24% of pretrial of people charged with federal crimes were detained in federal court. So it was a big problem. Like a quarter of all people who were charged were too poor to get out of jail. But today, as I'm talking to you all, and this is another thing I try to explain in the book, 72.4% of federal people charged with crimes are detained. So we got rid of the wealth-based detention of detaining people just because they couldn't pay, but we tripled actual detention. And if you look at the numbers today, people charged in federal court are more disproportionately Black, more disproportionately Latinx, more disproportionately poor than they were 36 years ago when we got rid of cash bail in federal court. And so you have to ask yourself, what happened with that lawyer-led, top-down driven reform? Well, it didn't change the underlying balance of power. So the same forces that created the cash bail system just designed its replacement. And that's the key. When we think about how to reform these systems, it's not just how do we tweak the policies, it's how do we build a force of well-meaning people, ordinary people, lawyers, non-lawyers, people who've been directly impacted by the system, people who have family who've been impacted by the system, people who haven't been impacted but just care about it. How do we all build that force to come together to demand not just a change in label, but a change in the actual way that human beings are being treated?
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask what might be a less interesting question, and it's one I've never asked you, but so, I mean, you began today by talking about Ms. Mitchell in Alabama. And I remember, so the one day that we clerked together, and the reason why it was one day is because I was finishing and Alec was starting, so we overlapped by one day. And as I recall, it must have been a day where there was a sentencing hearing, because you asked, as a judicial clerk on your first day, Fred, do you think prisons are immoral? And so the question I want to ask you, I want to go before even we get to Ms. Mitchell. What do you think it is about the way that you see the world that caused you on the first day to ask a question that, you know, I'd gone a year without ever asking?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I don't know what it is. But I've always wondered, whenever I see real pain and real trauma, and that is really all you can see when you go into a local jail, when you go into a local prison, when you go into someone's living room and you talk to a child about what it's like to be without her dad or her mom, I always wanted to ask myself, um, is creating this pain and this trauma absolutely necessary? If it's absolutely necessary for the greater good, okay, we can start talking about it. But if it's not absolutely necessary, why are we doing it? And what are the problems that it's purporting to address? And could we address those problems in other ways? And so when I look at the punishment bureaucracy, I don't see a system that was designed to effectively address the problems that it's talking about. For example, if you look at like the war on drugs, that was announced. We now know, it had very racist actual intentions when it was announced, from the Nixon tapes. But even if you look before that, when opium was first criminalized, it was to give police the power to go after Chinese immigrants. That's why they introduced those laws. Same with cocaine and black people in the South. Same with marijuana and Mexican immigrants. Like the reason that various substances became criminalized, I go through a lot of this in the book in much more detail. But the reason those things became criminalized wasn't because someone determined that marijuana use was such a threat to everyone that it had to be criminalized, and that criminalization was the way to reduce marijuana usage, right? So if you look at like tobacco or alcohol or sugary soda drinks, which kill more people than all drugs combined, we've chosen to deal with other unhealthy things in a way that isn't criminal. We choose to deal with many, many harmful things like employment discrimination or sexual harassment in ways that don't involve the criminal law at all. So it's not clear to me that anything that causes harm should be subjected to criminal punishment. And it's not clear to me that the way to stop sexual harassment would be to cage everyone who does sexual harassment, right? And it's not clear to our society either, right? Because we don't deal with sexual harassment in that way at the workplace. So what I wanted to ask is, and then if you look at the war on drugs, by the way, like we've spent trillions of dollars on the war on drugs. We've detained and caged tens of millions of people. We've separated hundreds of millions of children from their parents. We've surveilled the entire communications network of this country and beyond. We have destroyed millions of acres of rainforest with deforestation throughout Latin America. The list goes on and on and on. We've raided hundreds of thousands of people's homes and killed many, many people. All of that happened in the war on drugs, and yet drug usage is higher than it was before. So these people who created the war on drugs, they're not stupid. It's not like they don't see all those things. It's just their goal actually isn't what they tell us their goal is. Their goal is something else. So I'm very skeptical when I hear someone say the way to get people to use opioids less is to cage the people that use them. I've seen no evidence in the entire history of the criminal system to support that proposition. What I have seen evidence for is that caging people is a very effective way of controlling poor people and black people. And so what I started asking myself was, whenever someone in power tells me that throwing someone in a cage is necessary, I should question that. I should ask, what are we getting out of this? Is the way to stop the epidemic of gender-based violence in this country caging people for short periods of time after they commit an act of gender-based violence? Or is it attacking a culture of classic masculinity? Is it attacking poverty? I believe that actually we would see a society with far less trauma and far less violence if we were investing in those things rather than investing in caging people. And so when I ask questions like, are prisons immoral? What I'm really asking is like, is the infliction of pain that prisons require necessary to deal with these social problems? And not only is it, in my opinion, not necessary, but I see prisons as exacerbating all of the very problems that they say they're trying to address.
So let me ask this then, right? So how does one know when we've reached that point where it's not being used in ways that are unnecessary, right? So is it a comparative exercise? Is it simply that when our numbers look the way that other countries' numbers look, and obviously we're a very long way from that. So, but that when that happens, is it that we've achieved? Should we just sort of assume that everyone else kind of gets it right, and we've reached the right balance, or is there something else that we should look for? Like, what is so when? Because I feel like there has to be a goal, right? So, what is that goal? What is that moment where we can look and say, we did it, or at least we made a substantial progress toward it?
Well, I would say, first of all, before we even get to that goal conversation, we could eliminate 80% of the American criminal system, and then be at our own historic levels, which were stable until 1980, and be around the other countries that have comparable wealth. So like before we even start to disagree about some of the more controversial things, like 80% of this stuff, like, 95% of all police arrests are not for serious violent crime. 96% of all police time is spent on non-serious, non-violent activity. So there's so much of this bureaucracy that anyone who actually looks at it doesn't think we need. And every single other society in the world has concluded is unnecessary. So I think I'm going to give you a more radical answer, but I don't want us to lose sight of how much agreement there really is and how uncontroversial it is to return this country's criminal punishment bureaucracy to the size that it was in 2010 or 2005 or 2000 or 1995 or 1990 or 1985, right? Those were just deliberate policy choices. It's not like Americans became more evil over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Those are just policy choices that we made to deal with increasing inequality. Now, what is the goal and the ideal? I mean, my more radical view, which people here on this call may or may not disagree with, is that a society that is radically more equal, that isn't driven by this unreckoned with history of white supremacy, that doesn't have such a dramatic amount of poverty and suffering and alienation, I believe that such a society would have very little need for what we currently look at as the criminal punishment bureaucracy. People would have safe places to live. People would have the food and clothing and shelter that they need. People would have the mental health treatment that they need. People wouldn't be driven through stress and anxiety and various environmental factors to the levels of mental illness that we've seen that are unprecedented now as well. The largest mental health provider in many jurisdictions in the US is the local jail. And if our society was actually dealing with those problems in a non-carceral, non-punitive setting, we could reduce the jail population by 30 or 40% just like that. So imagine what it would look like in a society where we were meaningfully where people had universal health care, where people had access to treatment whenever they needed it, where people had the kinds of connections in their community through art and theater and music and poetry and sports and other things that were bringing people together, and people had the basic sustenance so they could pursue those things and participate in them without worrying about whether they have food or diapers. I believe that a society like that would have very little need for the criminal system. We could argue about, whether there's 1% of the 2% of the people that are currently in prison that are some kind of like natural predator that would exist in any world. But now we're talking about 1 or 2%, right? And not 100%. And I think we have to start moving toward that. We won't know the exact answer to your question about how to sequester people who are truly predatory and dangerous from the rest of society. But all I can tell you is that the number of such people is very, very low.
All right. There's. I mean, again, there's lots of directions to go. Let's talk about power and empowerment, right? So you suggested that one of the solutions in terms of kind of dealing with the political economy of the criminal legal system is to make people who currently don't have a lot of political power, people who are poor, people who are Black and poor, which is a particularly dangerous combination when it comes to one's potential life outcomes and how they're going to be treated in the criminal legal system. that we need to find ways to empower such groups so that they can be in a position to kind of basically kind of overcome some of the other systems that we've heard about. Can you talk more about that work? What does that empowerment really look like?
Again, I'm not, the real expert in this, but based on my work with those who are experts, I can offer an answer. I mean, I think number one, it's trying to dismantle and at least shrink the systems that are actively preventing that power building, that are actively preying on those communities. So like in Georgia, for example, which is the world leader in probation, a higher cap percentage of people are on probation than any place in the world history in Georgia. And probation is a mechanism of controlling poor Black people and of extracting wealth from them through these fees. It's a way of constantly keeping people afraid of going back to jail, constantly keeping in this cycle of debt and jailing, right? Same thing with policing. Modern policing is basically targeted at poor Black neighborhoods. The surveillance, the facial recognition software, the resources that are spent on police, the constant sort of threat of warrants. And when you and I got to Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants per household, almost all of which for Black people, almost all of which for unpaid debt. So there's these systems that are preying on those communities. So the number one, the first sort of emergency thing we need to do is shrink the power of these systems that are actively preventing these people from getting to a non-crisis point in their lives when they can think about organizing, right? Number two, there's some really amazing organizing going on all over the country that is trying to build power. Things I'm most interested in are things like developing worker-owned co-ops for formerly incarcerated people to take ownership of their own business. A lot of people are interested in small businesses, and I think it's a really fantastic way of building power in the community, one that should be really bipartisan. And if you think about a city like Atlanta, and with all of the universities and the municipal government, the universities and the hospitals and the government in Atlanta are the single largest purchaser of things like laundry services, janitorial services, landscaping, utilities. They could do something like what Cleveland did and reserve a huge percentage of those contracts, not for large multinational corporations, but for local Atlanta worker-owned businesses that were majority owned by people who've been incarcerated or targeted by police. Some places are trying to think through how to do this with marijuana business licensing, but imagine like local groups of lawyers and business leaders who came together and said, we're going to help people who've been incarcerated or impacted by the system set up their own laundry and janitorial businesses, and then we're going to give the contracts from Emory or the city of Atlanta to those businesses, right? Now all of a sudden, you're not only building political engagement in those groups, but you're also building economic power. You're building relationships with the city, and you're helping local Atlanta businesses. So I think like creating a vibrant culture of actual worker-owned businesses that aren't owned by Amazon or Aramark or all these multinational corporations, but that are actually owned by people in the community is a huge untapped resource that the business and lawyer community in Atlanta should really be behind. The same is true with community land trusts. Instead of giving out all this money to developers to gentrify the city should be investing in land trusts that are owned and controlled by people in these neighborhoods. And there's some really exciting stuff happening all over the country around creation of different models of land use and land ownership. But traditionally, cities like Atlanta, and you guys are all much more expert on this than I am, but they've, like if it's anything like DC, local politics is really influenced by developers to a tremendous degree. And those developers are thinking about how to make a profit and not thinking about how to build Black wealth. Those are just a couple of examples of things that excite me a great deal. Tenants organizing together is another one. Obviously shrinking the budget of police forces and taking that money and investing in things like poetry and theater and music and after school programs for kids is a no-brainer. when you look at the waste, fraud, and abuse in police budgets, it's astonishing. What if the government said, you know, we're going to take $40 million from the Atlanta Police Department, and we're going to set up a first of its kind theater program for kids that have never been able to be exposed to theater before? Imagine the benefits of that. The police could cut that from their budget without even blinking an eye. And we need to develop the coalitions in each of these communities that actually are demanding that.
So there's a lot that I appreciate about the empowerment, like focusing more on empowerment. I'm on the board of Invest Atlanta, and I'm particularly interested in hearing more about offline about the Cleveland story when it comes to helping businesses that involve a lot of folks that are owned by folks who have been incarcerated. I do want to, though, on some of this, I want to share a few things. So last time I knocked on doors for a local candidate, it was in the poorest district in the city of Atlanta. And when I knocked on doors, and when the question sort of, you know, what is it that you want? What do you want to see? Or when I went to community meetings there, a lot of people were saying that they wanted a stronger police presence. In addition, about a year or two ago, Invest Atlanta, we were asked to commit $500,000 to additional video cameras in a poor Black neighborhood. And my question was, well, have you talked to the people on the ground there? Have you talked to the neighborhood leaders and so forth? And I wanted to make sure that's what they wanted. And it turned out that's what they were asking for. So, and I say all of this to kind of ask, is it clear always that empowering these communities will necessarily mean less of a role for the criminal legal system, or might it look like a different type of role, or just kind of what should I do with that? How do we deal with that part of the story? Because it's not the case that in poor Black neighborhoods, people are overwhelmingly only saying less police. Some people are saying that, and some people aren't.
A very thorny set of questions. And I'll just, there's a lot to say about that. Number one, there has been a multi-decades-long propaganda effort to promote carceral policies, to make people think that the solution to these problems is not housing or healthcare or reducing poverty, but law enforcement. And I talk in the book about how I think the term law enforcement is itself a term of propaganda, because the police are only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time in some places. They're not enforcing the laws around mortgage fraud that led to a lot of foreclosures. They're not enforcing various laws that would prevent eviction by slumlords. They're enforcing some laws, and but there's nonetheless a tremendous, and this is across local media, national media, there are very powerful people that are investing in these narratives, that are owning the media, that are using their capital, that are working with police, that are working with developers, that are working with powerful politicians to change the way people think and to limit the scope of the horizon of what they think is possible. And I have found everywhere I've looked that it really matters how you ask these questions to people. If you ask them, the only resources we're willing to give you are more police cameras, they'll say, yeah, of course I want that. I want my kid to be safe walking home, and that makes me feel safe. But if you ask them, would you rather have a safe neighborhood in a larger home, in some green space, and after school programming for the kids, and free access to healthcare and a legal clinic, and all these things, they say, of course I want those things, right? And so a lot of this is the sort of powerful elite are actually framing the questions that are being asked to these communities. And they are taking advantage of and rewarding certain people from those communities who are willing to toe their line. And James Forman's book, Locking Up Our Own, is a really great example of how, members of the Black community, working, sort of more elite members of the Black community, working with developers, working with police, working with various corporate interests, actually were the ones who built DC's mass incarceration system. And so it's a really complicated question. It's about race, of course, but it's also about capitalism, and it's about a system that has really been serving the interests of people who own things, which is mostly white people who own things, but not exclusively. And so, that's a really hard propaganda fight to be fighting against. So it's not surprising that many people are, their first reaction is to take what the system is offering. But all I can say is that from working with a lot of people who are organizing these communities, when people are presented with a more full understanding and a more full vision of the scope of what's possible, they tend to not want police, in my experience, and they tend to want real investment that's going to give them a job and a house and healthcare and things like that. So I don't know. I mean, I think you're identifying a thorny problem of what I think of as a very big propaganda success for the current system. As Mariam Kaba, the incredible visionary sort of abolitionist organizer and scholar, says, the fact that someone is oppressed doesn't necessarily mean that they yet have an analysis of their oppression. And one of the dangers of having people like me is that we don't have experience and with a lot, so we're likely to not fully understand these issues. But and so there's many problems with having like more, people who've gone to fancy schools and who've had more time and ability to read about things, doing any kind of leadership role. But that doesn't mean that you have to defer to someone just because they've experienced harm, because what we've seen time and time again is that the people that are controlling our society, they're very powerful, are very adept at picking out particular examples of people who've experienced harm who are towing the party line. So I think it's much more complicated, Fred. I think we need to engage in real, meaningful conversations in these communities about, with a larger sense of what the potential options are. And I think it's fraught. It's very difficult, and it's something that people like me just shouldn't be leading at all. And that's something that really has to come from people in the communities themselves. So I'm not a great person to answer your question. It's very hard for me as a very privileged white person to like speak about that issue. I hope I've done your question justice. But I'm not sure.
No, I mean, it was not an easy question. And it's, it's something that I definitely, have thought a lot about over the last year in particular, because there's, I've seen sharp disagreement from various communities. There's some of it seems to be generational, maybe not all of it. Some of it, I think, is simply that the folks who have the time and the resources to go to community meetings and so forth, that if you go to a community meeting, you might not be getting an accurate snapshot of the true sentiments of the community for various reasons, right? So, and you kind of have to dig deeper. And then some of it might be kind of what you're saying too, around kind of expanding imaginations, giving more options in terms of of just even what is possible. I mean, there's so much of what you say that I find really important. I'm trying not to just kind of make this a story about Invest Atlanta, but another piece of what you talked about was land trusts, which is something that we're trying to do more and more of. To do that effectively, you have to actually at some point own the property, right? So the reason why it's much easier to do affordable housing by way of developers is because developers actually purchase the property. the city of Atlanta can't afford, actually, in any meaningful way, to purchase property and this is becoming true in more and more neighborhoods around the city. And to kind of do that deep long-term affordability, it helps to at least temporarily own it in order to pass it on to a land trust. But I think it is really critically important that that we keep fighting and keep being more creative and keep looking to other places that are doing it better, because that always helps to show that it's a way. And goodness forbid that maybe Atlanta can be the leader on some of these issues as well, so that other places are looking at us and saying, well, how did Atlanta do it? I'd love more stories like that. I'm really kind of, I think we've run the gamut. I don't know if typically people in the audience ask questions or.
Sure, absolutely, Fred. Thank you. Anybody, if you have a question or a comment, please pop it up on chat so everyone can see. I was just going to ask each of you maybe to just give a closing comment or thought that you would leave with us in these times.
I want Alec to be able to end because he's more eloquent than I am on these issues and more knowledgeable and is very much on the front line. So I'll start so that he gets kind of the last word. But what I'm going to say is something I probably learned a lot from him, which is just to make sure that we're looking at ways that we've become desensitized to things that don't have to be normal. And I'm going to give a very bizarre example. So just a few days ago, or really maybe this was yesterday, all time is kind of blurring together now. And one of the things that went viral in the last few days were people at airports who participated in the insurrection and the domestic terrorist attack at the United States Capitol. And in one of the videos, and so people were sharing these videos gleefully, right? Gleefully showing these videos of people who were being arrested and detained. And in one of the videos, there's this woman and she's sitting on the ground and she's asking, what's going to happen to my kids? And the person who's recording the video asks, officer, can you answer her? What's going to happen to her kids? And the officer replies, this isn't the first time that we've arrested someone who has kids. We do this all the time, right? And that was the answer. That was the response. That was the defense, right? It's a close cousin of whataboutism. It's not quite, but it's in that same sort of family of argument that because it's happened before, it's okay for it to be happening in this slightly different context to someone else. And so the people who are sharing these stories are on the left, right? Predominantly, I would suspect. But I found myself wondering, well, what is going to happen to her kids? And what also more broadly happens to all the kids in all of the other moments where this happens? And so basically what I'm asking us to do is to make sure that we're finding empathy in situations and for people for whom we're not always accustomed to or really kind of primed to show empathy toward, because if we're going to find the way out of this, it's going to require exactly that from people who don't have empathy right now for the people who are suffering the most. So we all have to kind of practice what we preach, search within ourselves, and I think that will help us see the way forward as well.
That was great. Yeah, very, very well said, and I echo everything Fred said. I'll take one practical thing and self-promotional thing, which is really encourage you to check out the book. Like I mentioned, all the royalties go to SE Justice Group, and I tried very hard to put sort of everything that I've learned in there, and and for it to be a real guide for how to think about the criminal system. And I've also been lucky enough to set up a fund so that we can get free copies of the book to any student in a class where a teacher wants to assign it in college or law school or high school even. And for every student that gets a book, there's a free book that's going to be given to someone in prison. And so if you know any teachers or professors, we can get you free copies of the book, and then we'll send them to people in prison too, so we can really spread the ideas that are in the book. And you may not agree with every idea that's in the book. I'm certainly coming from a more radical perspective because of some of the things I've seen in the system. But I think that and I've gotten some really amazing notes from people all over the country, even for people that are coming from a different perspective. There's a lot in the book that is useful as you think about how to think about the criminal punishment bureaucracy. And then the less practical thing is we have a lot of work to do. And I think we all have to understand the ways in which we are complicit in the bad things in the horrific and the unspeakable things that our legal system does. And I think too often we're afraid to call them out because it's really difficult to speak out about things in a culture that is where they're normalized. And the only way forward that I've been able to find is to band together with other people and do it together. These problems are so entrenched. They're so difficult emotionally. You need that support. You need to build a group of people that is fighting these things together. And so I just encourage you to think about who are the people in your life that are interested in fighting these things with you. How do you develop reading groups and organizations? How do you join existing organizing against this stuff? How do you make the Bar Association the force for justice that it could be? I don't know the answers to these questions, and they're different in every community. I think we should all be thinking about not just the individual concerns that tend to dominate our lives, our families, especially in a time like this where there's so much fear for the health of our loved ones. But how do we, if we don't do something major, our society is going to continue along this path, and I think we're in real trouble. So just think more about what role you can all play in this fight, and what role we can play together.
Thank you, Alec, very much. And thank you, Fred. This has been amazing, enlightening, and challenging. And we are grateful to you. We really are. If you're still on, unmute and please join me in thanking them. We really appreciate it. Please grab, if you can, Usual Cruelty, Alec's book, and take a look at it. It's really a phenomenal and important book. Next month we have with us another law professor like Fred. Thomas Wilson Mitchell at Texas A&M University, who's a 2020 MacArthur Genius Fellow, is going to talk to us about something that on its face doesn't sound all that sexy, but is really sexy in substance, and that is heirs property and the disadvantaged way many people have been hurt by that for the last 150, 200 years. In particular, communities of color, rural communities, and poor urban communities. So we'll continue in some of the same themes, only from really a very different angle. We welcome you to come back and join us if you can. Each month we've got a Zoom at noon. Keep in touch with us, send us your thoughts, and above all else, you and those you love, please stay well.